the Home Secretary, that's Yvette Cooper, has announced plans for 5 new local inquiries into the rape gang scandal.
Well, the announcement came a day after former Greater Manchester Police Detective Maggie Oliver threatened the Home Secretary with legal proceedings unless action was taken.
Well, police forces will also be encouraged to reopen cold cases, and victims are being urged to report what they call historic cases.
Well, here's what the Home Secretary said in the House of Commons yesterday.
Effective local inquiries can delve into far more local detail and deliver more locally relevant answers and change than a lengthy nationwide inquiry can provide. So Tom Crowther, KC, chair of the Telford inquiry, has agreed to work with the government to develop a new framework for victim-centred, locally led inquiries where they are needed, and as a first step, to work with Oldham Council and up to 4 other pilot areas.
Oh, a bit vague, isn't it? Anyway, it was all met with criticism from the Shadow Home Secretary.
Home Secretary just announced government support for only 5 local inquiries. Let me say this is wholly inadequate when we know up to 50 towns are affected. So I have some serious questions for the Home Secretary. Firstly, how are the other 40 plus towns supposed to get answers to the questions that they have?
Well, let's get more on this from our national reporter, Charlie Peters. Good to see you, Charlie. I mean, does this go far enough? What are survivors telling you?
All the people who were campaigning for a national inquiry yesterday morning are still campaigning for a national inquiry. And the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, has today described this as a toothless grooming gangs probe. Now, the government say that the key part of this will be this rapid audit, a 3-month investigation, independent of the Home Office, led by Baroness Casey, to look into previous examples of child sexual exploitation, to really get to grips with the extent of this crisis, and also, crucially, to look at cultural, societal and ethnicity drivers behind the abuse. They hope that by doing so, they might be able to expose what's been going on or even reassure the public about this situation. We've heard Chris Philp there, the Shadow Home Secretary, leading the criticism of Yvette Cooper, but actually the more effective response came from Sarah Champion, the Labour MP in the backbenches, who asked the Home Secretary, will these local inquiries have statutory footing? Because she was very elated when this mooted announcement was first floated from the Home Office early yesterday. We didn't know what to expect, but very quickly we realised that what Sarah Champion wants, what many of the people who are backing a national inquiry want, wasn't going to be delivered. In all of the local inquiries we've had, including the Telford-style inquiry, which is now being promoted, no one's been compelled to give evidence. Nobody is held accountable. And Jess Phillips, the Safeguarding Minister, has said, we know what works, the Telford-style victim-centred model works. But if you ask the survivors from those areas, what did you get from that inquiry? They said they got some truth, but they didn't get any justice. Nobody was sacked, nobody was investigated.
Well, that seems to be the point with this, because if it's this audit, if you like, I mean, trying to assess the scale of what has gone on and in what communities it has gone on, but that doesn't therefore seem to necessarily ask the questions as to what failings allowed this to happen.
Precisely, and that's been a consistent problem with so many of these reviews you've had so far, even the major ones into Rotherham. No police officers were sacked as a consequence of the grave failings there. No local officials who neglected to investigate, or in many cases actively covered up investigations, were held accountable for that. Survivors around the country, many thousands of them, have had to put up with this time and time again. Now, we're going to have this local review into Oldham as one of the 5 areas, but they've not said what the other 4 areas are. And so there's this horrible situation we're in now for survivors. You've told me yesterday that they're essentially hoping that their area might get picked in this lottery, in a lottery of grooming gang investigations. They hope that their town, in one of the 50 different areas in the country where GB News has found reports of this pattern of abuse taking place, they're hoping that they might win the investigations lottery. That's a really appalling space for them to be in, hoping that maybe Tameside will be investigated, maybe the Bradford district will get picked, because so many of these areas have never, ever had any sort of review, even if this level of review that's being promoted, they say, isn't going to be enough.
What do you make of the timing of this announcement from Yvette Cooper? Do you think it's anything to do with the legal action threatened by Maggie Oliver?
I think unconnected, because the timing isn't quite so linked, but Maggie Oliver's legal action, and specifically about the 20 recommendations being implemented, they already said they were going to do that and they would set out a timetable.
Well, but we haven't had a timetable.
They're going to publish one in the spring. I think the 20 recommendations piece will come quite straightforward. The more difficult political problem for them and the timing of this is the fact that 11 days ago now, Sir Keir Starmer said that people calling for a national inquiry were jumping on a bandwagon spread by the poison of the far right. And so, with all this relentless pressure, all the polling showing that even Labour voters want this inquiry, even Labour voters see it as a cover-up, they can't very suddenly do a U-turn on this. It's politically impossible. They need to do a 3-month audit, develop their own case for a further inquiry. And I heard some commentators say yesterday that they feel as though this government is now tiptoeing towards a full national inquiry. They've just got to make their own case for it.
Well, I wondered if that was the case. But by the fact that this is described as, and these 5 local inquiries are being described as pilots.
Pilot schemes, precisely.
Which is extraordinary, actually. It's extraordinary language when you're talking about something on this scale that is this serious.
Right, and imagine if you're one of those survivors waiting to see if you're going to be picked for a pilot scheme. Does that mean that something more sufficient would come down the line later? This is just you're assessing what could be done. Fundamentally, the Labour government cannot be seen to be dancing to the tune of Elon Musk and media pressure, which is exposing the extent of this issue. And so they do need to, for their own political strategy, build their own case for this approach. I'm pretty convinced that's what's going on at the moment, that we are tiptoeing towards a national inquiry. And I think it's quite clear from survivors and their families I spoke to yesterday, they're not going to be placated by this halfway house approach. They don't think it's sufficient. Some survivors met with Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, yesterday in Birmingham. Those are survivors from Oldham. A couple of them were enthused by what happened, but others said they felt as though they're just being put back in their box, saying, we've done something for you now, stop complaining. Marlon West, the father of a survivor in Tameside in Greater Manchester, where there's never been any sort of review. His daughter was groomed by gangs in Rochdale as recently as 2 years ago, and there are many ongoing struggles there. He told me that he'll absolutely continue to fight for a national inquiry, and he was grateful for the level of pressure on the government to put this on a statutory footing, because fundamentally, all the survivors and campaigners say that regardless of the kind of inquiry you have, whether it's victim-centred local review, judge-led, government-led, there's no point in doing it unless you can compel witnesses, unless you can prosecute people on the stand and ask them, why did you not do that, or why did you do that? Are you more scared about political correctness than you are about the security and justice for young women and girls, and indeed some boys in our country? Those are the sort of questions they want to put to people, and so far, that's not going to happen.
Do you think these 5 local investigations will dampen, if not extinguish, those accusations of a cover-up?
Labour are in deep trouble on that perspective, because the polling that we had 2 days ago showed that even Labour voters thought there had been a cover-up on this issue. But when you drill down into what they think the cover-up is, it gets even more interesting. It's not just political correctness. The dominant factor for the cover-up, people believe, is corruption. Yeah. Active influence of local officials, elected councillors and police officers conspiring to prevent investigation. We have seen some of that already in the local reviews, which again couldn't even compel witnesses. So people know this is a problem, and they're nervous, I think, about what might be exposed fully if a full inquiry was launched. There will be people in politics right now, sitting in local authorities, worrying that what might come down the line may expose grave failings in their areas, and someone, somewhere, will need to be held to account for it.
Do you know what I can't get my head around, Charlie, with all of this? And I know I'm the oldest on this desk by quite a long way. But obviously, the Rotherham issues, the Oldham issues, it was reported, there were prosecutions. As someone who talks about the news every day, I had no idea, no concept that this was as bad as it actually is. And that's going to be my lingering issue with this, is that how has this rumbled under the surface for so long and it hasn't made the news? There haven't been reports, there haven't been local politicians standing up and yelling and screaming about this.
The writer Ben Sixsmith described it last week as a conspiracy of murmuring. For decades in the country, we've sort of reflected on this issue quietly. Everyone's rumbled around about how bad it is, but there's never been a proper national effort to join the dots to expose the nationwide extent of the atrocity and also to really show just how appalling this kind of abuse is. I'm conscious this is a breakfast programme, but people need to just read the sentencing remarks from some of these appalling trials. Or if you can attend a sentencing, often sentencings that GB News have been to, we've been the only outlet there. People have moved away from this scandal. They don't think it has the gravitas and extent that it truly does. But it's been a mission of this channel to really bring it back to the forefront of the national coverage. We're seeing now politicians discussing our analysis. We heard it there from Chris Philp, the 50 different towns and cities. That was a GB News investigation showing that it wasn't just a handful of isolated northern towns and areas in the Midlands. This goes all the way from Bristol, Banbury, Buckingham, High Wycombe, all the way up to Glasgow and Dundee. We've got grooming gangs with this sort of pattern of abuse all over the country. Now, we had a grooming gangs task force launched in April 2023 on the back of a GB News investigation. That arrested over 550 perpetrators in 1 year and protected over 4,000 victims. If that doesn't show politicians just how widespread this problem is, that it's not something of the past, that it's ongoing and that many people are still escaping justice, then who knows what will.
OK, Charlie Peters, thank you so much for your hard work on this.
Let's start with the Daily Mail, should we? What are we to make of this inquiry? Not national inquiry, sort of 5 local inquiries into rape gangs that Yvette Cooper's talking about.
I think this is largely pointless. We don't know. We only know one of the areas, which is going to be Oldham. We don't know where the other areas are going to be. We don't know what the terms of reference are going to be. And they cannot compel witnesses to come forward. So you do wonder why you're handing local areas the ability to look into the problems in those areas, which were probably largely caused by people in those areas, local councils, local police forces. You're asking them to mark their own homework. It doesn't really strike me as a good use of time. It's going to be very expensive and inevitably is going to end up with a national inquiry at some point. So why not just get started? Let's put some of the Alexis J recommendations in order and have a wider inquiry into those areas, a proper one.
But Alexis J says there shouldn't be another inquiry.
I think there should. Now, I'm bow down to her superior knowledge. She did a very good review, but it was into child exploitation in general. It wasn't specific to what we're looking at now. So there was a time for her inquiry because we do need to look at abuse of children, absolutely.
But all children ought to be protected.
Yes, they should. But now we've moved on and now we are seeing the extent of an issue in certain areas. Why do we not want to circle in and say, actually, we need to look specifically in certain areas, at certain demographics, at certain problems, which will affect all children as well, because it's not just going to be confined and it's never going to happen again. We don't want that to happen in other areas. So I do think that we need to look at it.
Is this just kicking the can down the road? I mean, if there are local investigations into 5 areas and the same themes are in those 5 areas, that will just open the door to a national inquiry because more needs to be exposed, clearly.
I think you're right. I think that is eventually what happens. What's clearly happened here is that Yvette Cooper has caved in to political pressure stoked up by Elon Musk. And as a result, she's come up with something that seems to have pleased no one. The survivors don't seem to like it. The Tories certainly don't like it. Even Labour's Sarah Champion is against doing it this way. What should have happened was actually where the government were previously, and that is that the priority must be to protect children in the future. The best way of doing that was to implement the J report, particularly a child protection authority. Then if you feel you needed a national inquiry, which I think Claire's right, we're going to end up with one anyway, you then look at how those measures are working. Are they the right things to put in place that will deal with it? So the idea you can actually, in the next 3 months, be able to do all the things that people are asking for, it is just not a goer.
I mean, what strikes me from this is it was and I hate to play politics with it, but obviously politics is part of this.
It shouldn't be, but
it
yes.
shouldn't be, but it
Yeah.
is that politically you've got to address this, and they don't seem to know how.
Well, I mean, that's why I think they're right in the first place. The way to address it, you start the process by getting the J recommendations in place that the Tories didn't do. That's stage one. That's the way of protecting all children. Then if you need to look into, after you've done that, you could then look into the grooming gangs to make sure the measures that have been put in place deal with that too.
But do they think this issue is just going to go away? Or the pressure is going to go away?
The Labour government don't seem to be able to deal with any kind of criticism, whether it is fair or not. The minute they come up against something and say, this is the decision we're taking, and everybody turns around, especially the opposition, which is what oppositions do, saying, no, you're wrong, you need to do this, it's awful, they tend to bow to that pressure. They are so risk-averse. They don't want to upset anybody. They don't want to look like they don't know what they're doing. However, this now looks even more like they don't know what they're doing because they're going into something which is going to be expensive, it's going to be relatively lengthy, and isn't going to achieve what it is.
Well, not lengthy enough. I mean, if it's only 3 months, I'm not quite sure what they can achieve in those 3 months.
But it's never going to be just 3 months. Louise Casey, who is going to be doing this report, is also doing the huge report.
She's got a handful,
social care,
hasn't she?
which is inevitably
Yeah.
going to take up more time than anything else. So to try and shoehorn something into 3 months, I think is ridiculous.
It's almost as like they need to be seen to be doing something.
Yeah.
I think that's what, it comes down to that. And that's what I mean about political pressure has made Yvette Cooper do what she's doing.
And it's a dangerous place to be when you need to be seen to be doing something and this looks like something. It rarely works well.